Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Martin, Director of Technical Marketing at Itential, and welcome again to another Itential webinar. Today, let's talk network compliance and automating it. I want to give you an introduction to our API compliance capabilities and features in the product. So let's take a look at what we will be going over and talking about today. For the demo overview, we will be doing things like reviewing some onboarded APIs to identify methods to use for compliance. To put it a different way is you have a lot of stuff, more modern network or maybe even cloud-based stuff, that in your environment, it is managed or at least can be managed through APIs. APIs give us a programmable way into those systems to describe the way things are configured. And we want to use those API methods as a baseline to start creating some configuration compliance templates so that we can make those API calls and compare them to our templates and determine if something is in compliance or not. It's very similar if you're already familiar with CLIs, networking, building compliance, but there are some differences, and that's what this whole overview is about today. So with that, we are going to build and test a golden configuration template for an API call or API calls. It could be any, but this is to serve as an example. And then, I think it's important because when I do this kind of presentation for CLI configuration compliance, network engineers already understand the foundations of CLIs and even building golden configuration templates, maybe in some other types of applications. But I think it's probably a good idea because most network engineers don't have a lot of time invested in understanding JSON and JSON objects. So I want to start with a little overview that helps for them to at least get some context before we jump into how to use a JSON, a JSON object or a JSON payload to build golden configuration lines with. I think that'll be helpful. So we'll do a little bit of that as an exercise to build before we build a configuration, and then we're going to go ahead and build an API configuration compliance golden configuration template. We're going to be able to generate compliance reports. We're going to iterate as we build this, so you can kind of see the process. And then to close it all out, we'll publish it. We'll publish an automation so that it can be run on a schedule, which is typically the way these things are intended to be used. We want to run compliance on a schedule and generate reports that somebody can look at. With that, we are going to be really primarily focusing on AWS for today's session. I'll show you something around Azure as well, just as an example. Again, this is really around API calls into whatever network or cloud services or components that are in your environment today. Any API call could be used if it just helps to describe a configuration for a network service or a network device. And with that in the platform, we will be visiting Configuration Manager. We'll be spending a lot of time there, but we will also take a look at building an automation through Automation Studio very quickly. And then Operations Manager is how we publish an automation when it's built. We'll be using all these components. And then Operations Manager is also where we can schedule an automation to run at a defined time. So with that, let me share my screen and we can get started. The first place I want to start is in our Automation Studio. We will be spending a lot of time building the golden configuration. That is not in Automation Studio. That is in Configuration Manager, which will be our next big stop in the platform. However, right when we start, I want to walk you through kind of the process that you would typically go through to determine like which API call, because this is all revolving around an API call into this case, AWS, to describe something. In our use case here, we're going to describe a network ACL, since that's pretty familiar for networking teams, just an ACL, an access control list. So AWS has VPCs, and VPCs have ACLs. These are kind of network components in AWS's cloud platform. The network ACL is assigned to a VPC, and it defines, just like a regular ACL on a router, that defines, the inbound or the outbound or the egress or ingress rules that are, by IP address that are allowed to come in and out. That's what we'll be playing around with today as our example. So how do you get started with that? Well, typically what I do, and one of the things about our platform is we make it super easy to integrate through APIs into all of your environment. And once things are integrated in, That's a topic for another webinar that we've done and we will do again in the future. But once those things are integrated in, they show up in this canvas here, this palette, this task palette. And this task palette allows us to select any of the API tasks that are grouped by that particular uh, integration. Like in this case, here's our AWS EC2 um, integration. So I can highlight all of this, and you'll see there's a lot of stuff here. And this is a great opportunity to kind of, especially if you don't have a background in understanding API or specifically REST APIs, AWS and even Azure, if you go to their website, you can look at their documentation and you can start to take a look at all the API calls. You'll also notice that when you take a look at their API documentation, that's the same documentation that, there's human readable documentation, but then the API is documented into into an open API or a Swagger specification file. And those are the kind of things we can directly import into our system. And these names of all these API calls are exposed from that document. And they should also match up to, because we're pulling right from AWS, match up to the documentation that you're looking at. And if you take kind of a broader look at the documentation, whether it's human readable or through the API spec file, you'll see that a lot of times REST APIs, the way they're done, especially if they're done well, it starts with a verb that kind of describes what's about to happen here, like to attach something, to authorize something, to cancel something. And so in AWS's example, in order to get a configuration, they use the verb describe. In Azure, in Azure, it could be get, right? Here they use the term describe. So if I scroll down here a little bit further, because there's a lot of API calls that we have available. But if we look at describe here, there we go. We're now in the describe section. Describe everything basically that can be configured in AWS. And for us, we want to describe network ACLs. This is the one we want to do because we give it a certain amount of information and it's going to tell us how that ACL is configured. And this is what we want to use as the basis for not only building a configuration template, but also we want to call this in order to describe the way the ACLs are currently configured so that we can compare it to the template that we build. So our first step is to go through here and to look through that. But as you kind of browse through here, you can see all kinds of network and non-network related API calls for descriptions. And again, any of these can be utilized in a golden configuration for APIs. So I've already created, it's just going to be a very simple automation here, a single task. There's a stub task. This is meant to be replaced with the right AWS API task is the description I gave it. So in this case, I want to grab the describe network ACLs and I'll just drop it there. And now I don't need this anymore. So I can delete that and I can drop this right into place. And so in our platform, this is an API call into AWS. If I double click it, it's going to have some requirements that it needs before it can run successfully. And so one of those requirements is if we look through here, there's a filter. It's not a requirement. These are defined by AWS themselves, but the one that we really need here is the network ACL ID. This is the unique identifier in AWS that specifies the network ACL that we want to describe. So where does that come from? Well, ultimately it comes from AWS, so that when you create one of these VPCs, it generates an ACL, or when you can create one and attach it, or you can modify one. And this is the one we'll be using. And this is the ACL, the unique ACL name. So I'm just going to copy that and go back to Automation Studio. And now I can fill this out here, network ACL ID. Now it's asking for a type of array. So I can't just paste it in. I have to put it in the data type that's required for the REST API call to AWS. That's where this is all defined. So we'll talk a little bit more about arrays in a minute, but an array is specified in JSON here as these square brackets, open and close square brackets, kind of as bookends. And then since this is a string, I'm going to use the strings to quote the actual string that I copied from the AWS console. So this is the ACL that we want to use. So if I exit out of here and save this, again, this is iterating this, I'm building an automation, but I really want to get the output of this to use this as kind of the baseline template that we can start with. So if I run this from here, and again, this is part of the testing and iteration process as we're building things in the platform, I'm going into another area of the platform called Operations Manager, which shows jobs being run as one of its functions. And this step is already run. We can tell by the green checkbox, and it ran successfully. And really, what I want to take a look at is I want to take a look at what happened when this ran. Specifically, what was the output of it? Because I just sent AWS a REST API call to describe a network ACL. I gave it the ACL name in the format that it needed it. And so I'm really interested in the output. And this is the output that I got. Um, the output I got is JSON. So you see all of this. And so I can actually take this now and copy the whole thing. And we're going to use this in a minute. This is where we're going to use this as a baseline. But now that I've gotten that, so I've identified the API call from AWS that I want because I'm working on network ACL. So now I want to start to build a golden configuration template, and we will use this output. So the next place I'm going to go into our platform is called Configuration Manager. This is where we can actually start to now build our golden configurations, and golden configurations that have been created will show up here. So let's create a new one. So if I click on this, I can select a golden configuration. I give it a unique name. This is going to be called Webinar API Compliance. And now the OS type. Because we support both CLI and API, you're going to find a bunch of traditional network CLI device types in here. Also, you're going to also see JSON. JSON is what we want to choose for APIs because in our platform, we represent everything as a JSON object. And that's why it's so critical to kind of understand the fundamentals of JSON. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. So I'm going to create this, and it's going to create a new golden configuration tree here. It's going to populate it with a base. And I won't go into all of the details of how we do it, but we can create child nodes off of this and use those as our starting point for our golden configuration template. So for this, I want to just create a new child. It's going to give it a unique name here. I'm going to rename it, and I'm just going to call this JSON example. And this is where we're just going to take a little bit of a detour and talk about JSON a little bit before we get into creating the golden configuration template for that API call that we just selected. So if I go to the configuration tab here, this is an editor that's now set up to understand and parse JSON. And what you're looking at is a simple JSON object. We know it's an object because in JSON, the objects are designated or bookended by this open and closed curly brace, the curly brace characters. And so this is an empty JSON, but it's completely valid. If I were, for instance, to delete something here, our JSON editor tells us, hey, there's something wrong, because we're missing that curly brace to end it. So if I save it, it would save that configuration, but in of itself, not very helpful. So let's build an example JSON, and I want to introduce you to the idea of keys and values and data types. So I talked about an object. So this is a JSON object itself, but it can and it will in a moment include other objects within it. Other things that we'll talk about are strings, Boolean variables, numbers, and arrays. These are different variable types. In the example of running that API call just a minute ago to ask AWS to describe a network ACL, I had to give it an array type. So I had to follow what AWS required of me to fill out that data. And once I had the right format, the AWS REST API call went through just fine. So we have to format data as part of automating really anything once you get into the world of automation, because especially API calls, they always require some sort of data format in the API call. And so you need to format that data correctly. And so understanding these key concepts, even within a JSON, is going to help you immensely. So let's start building this JSON out very simply. So now this is an empty JSON. So I hit enter, and it's going to try to reformat everything in the editor to make it a little cleaner for us. So now let me give you your first key. The key is going to be in double quotes, and I'm going to give it a unique name, calling it first name. And so that's a key that identifies this piece of data that I'm about to type in. And this data is on. Now notice everything is in double quotes here. This means it's a string. So now the JSON understands that it's got a key named first name, and right now the value that's associated with this key is John. That makes perfect sense, right? That's a first name. So this is going to hold this data for us. And remember, JSON is a standard. JSON is a standardized format. It's text based. It's not unique to any kind of programming language. It's actually quite portable, and pretty much every programming language has some sort of JSON utilities, libraries, modules that make it easy to manipulate, read, manipulate, and parse JSON. So it's good to understand it because you're probably going to run into a lot of it going forward if you haven't already. So I hit enter there, and now notice I put a comma there because I intend on having another field here. So again, logically, last name, and this is also a string. And as I continue to add more keys and values, I need to put commas in because that specifies there's something else coming after this. So I did two strings, two keys. So I have two keys, first name, last name, that are assigned strings, John and Smith, unique name, right? Now let's do something else. Let's create another key here, and let's call this favorite colors. And now I'm going to put something a little bit different in here. Instead of a string, I'm going to put an array. Remember, I said an array is designated by the square brackets, open and closed. So when I put in the square bracket, the opening square bracket, the editor put in the corresponding closed square bracket to make it easier for me. And now an array can have multiple elements within it, and those can be any kind of data type. I'm going to use strings here. So if John Smith's favorite colors are obviously going to be blue, and a comma because I've got another value here, um, orange and yellow. How about that? So now I've created an array. So this is a little bit different. It's an array of strings. Why strings? Because they're in double quotes. All of these values are double quotes. So that's a string, but it's a string of arrays. So each element has a number. That's how you identify or reference elements in an array. So the first element would be given the number 0, the second element 1, this yellow would be 2, so it would be the element 0 for the key favorite colors is blue, right? And then on and on until if there's more and more elements in the array. But that's the array. And now I'm going to continue on JSON, and I'm going to create another field now, and we're going to call it favorite number. And whoops, number 7, because lucky number 7. This is not a string, it's a number. Why is it a number? Because it's numerical and it doesn't have quotes around it. So this is going to be considered inferred as a number based off of the JSON object, the rules of JSON objects. Okay, so that's that. And then we can finally put in one last one, and we can say uh, lives in USA, value, colon, and then I'm going to say true. This is a Boolean variable. Boolean variables can either be true or false. You can think of them as 0 or 1, on or off. There's a number of ways to think about it. But in this case, it's either going to be true or false. Notice that it's color highlighted as true. I could have made it false. This is different. It's not a string because it's not in quotes. It's not in double quotes. And because this is the last item in the JSON, the last key and value in the JSON, I don't put a comma after it. So if I save this, this is a perfectly valid. So the editor is parsing this to ensure it's perfectly valid by looking at the way it's formatted. If I don't have enough braces or brackets or whatever, it's not going to save it, and it's going to give me an error message. So this is a perfectly valid JSON. And again, this is a template, right? This is not a network config of any kind. This is just a JSON template. And this is what I wanted to show you. So this is kind of the baseline of some of the things that you'll want to learn for our platform for sure, but having this knowledge is really going to be helpful as well. So there's lots of ways to learn JSON objects, and we plan on showing you even more JSON objects and building JSON objects within our platform in the future. But I think this is at least gives you some things to start with. Now, I built that within the golden configuration compliance so that I can show you now how we operate on this data. So for instance, now I can start to create rules. So I built basically a config template is what I've done. It's not appropriate to anything specific, network wise, it's just an example. But now if I highlight one of these lines and right click, now we get the ability to start creating some rules. And you'll notice here we have the ability to evaluate whether something is required, disallowed, or ignored on a line by line basis. Um, if one of these things is identified, we have a severity. So if something is required and it's not there, then we can generate a severity. These severities have weights or numerical weights to them so that you can create a numerical scale and identify when there are too many warnings or too many infos that require somebody to take a look at. Because some things may not be as some configurations, whether they're CLI or JSON and API oriented, some configurations may not be that big a deal. Some configurations may be a huge deal, right? An ACL that's improperly configured is a big deal. That should generate an error. Whereas maybe a description on something that's missing, it should be there, but it's not, should be maybe informational. We'll also take a look at this as well. So we give the ability to identify, remember the key and the values I talked about, taking a look at keys, and checking values in a way that iterates across a list of many things like an array. So in this case, I've highlighted first name. So what I want to do is I want to say, hey, that's a required field. And if that field doesn't exist, it should generate an error. And if I click update, we have now just created a severity error. So this is now required. So this is a template. And if I were to compare this to something that generated a similar configuration, it would say, hey, that first name has to be there on that similar configuration. And if it didn't, it would generate an error. I don't see the key first name. It's not looking at the value. It's just simply looking at the key. Same with this. So I can now do the same thing here. I can say that's required, generate an error, update, and do that as well. What about this? What about this field right here? I've skipped over that for a moment. What about this field is here, favorite number? Now we can say, well, that's disallowed. We really don't want to have that in there. And that's not a big deal. So maybe we just do a warning. And so now we've created a rule that it once evaluated, if we get a configuration we're comparing this our standard, and that configuration that we've pulled in through an API call has favorite number, that's disallowed. That key should not even exist. So there are going to be cases where that's important. There's going to be cases where certain things must exist and are required. There are going to be cases where certain things are, don't they're disallowed and they should never exist in the configuration as a key. And then there are cases where maybe like lives in the United States, maybe we just ignore that, right? And we update that. And now you can see all these symbols that pop up that identify different kinds of rules that have been created based off of this template. And now this is kind of how you get started with JSON and then defining rules on the JSON. Again, we saw the JSON configuration just a moment ago from the AWS call. We'll get to that in a moment. One last thing here that I want to show you is JSON objects that come back from API calls, especially for complex network configurations or network services, are going to lead to more complex JSON objects. And so I talked about an array. We see strings here. I'm sorry, we talked about objects. Here's some strings. Here's an array of strings that ups the complexity a little bit. We've got numbers, we've got Booleans. There are other types and things, but that's a lot of that you'll be working on in the platform or the primaries. But you can have an array that's not strings. You can have an array of numbers. You can have an array of objects that include other key value types. So it can get really complex, and that's critical to understand because you need rules that allow you to kind of iterate and delve through some of that complexity. So we could make this more complex by creating an array. So we're going to use our same array, but I can now say that array is a little more complex. I'm going to create an array. Let me get it formatted correctly here. That includes an object that has oops, put that inside there, that has a key called color in every object with a different value. Now we're starting to up our complexity game a little bit. So now let me save this, and you'll see this was a valid JSON. Otherwise, it wouldn't have saved it and reformatted it. So the editor says, yep, that's a valid JSON. So now we've upped the complexity a little bit. And this is what you're going to start to see as you evolve into looking at more and more complex JSONs from API calls. Favorite colors is still an array, but the array is different now. It's not just a bunch of string entries like blue, orange, yellow. It actually includes an object. Remember, I said a JSON object can have more objects. Well, here we go. An array of 3 objects, and each object has a key called color, and then the value is something different: blue, orange, yellow. So this serves as a great example to show some of the more complex stuff that we can do inside of the platform. Um, so, for instance, remember I said that an array has an element number. So the first element of the array, which is this object, is element 0, then 1, then 2, because things start with 0 in when you in code, not necessarily humans, but code. So if I click on this first element and right click, you'll notice that our rules now have identified that this is the first element of the favorite colors, the key favorite colors. It's the first element, and it's identifying the key color. And so this is important because this allows us to now do some interesting things where we can iterate through all of this entire array. So I can pull this over here. So for instance, I can now create a rule that's required, and now I can start to use this object key. This allows us to dynamically iterate through this list of items, looking for this particular key color. So now if I update this, you'll see that key object is required. So what that rule simply has done is it said, for when we're looking through this array, every element of the array, it's going to iterate through there and look for the key color, and that has to be there. It has to be there. It's a requirement. We can also go one layer deeper than that, and we can also say, if I click check every key, and I can also check value, I can also not only check for the key, but check for the value that's assigned to the key as well. So if I update that now, it still shows us the object key required, but now the rule is a little more complex. It's going to iterate through the array, and it's going to look for the requirement of a key for every one of these elements that's set to color, but also it's going to look for blue. And so what would happen then in our experiment here is that if we brought in this configuration from somewhere else, and this is our template, the first time it iterates through the color, through this array, the color value for the key will be there, but it'll be blue, set to blue. So that would be a successful test for that. But as soon as it iterated to the next one, it would test for the key for the color key to be there, which it would be, but the value of it would be orange, in which case this would be out of compliance, because the expectation is that we're iterating through all of these, and color blue should be in all of them. So I know this is kind of like, how does this make sense? It will make sense in a moment, and I'll give you a hint. Certain, especially in ACLs, certain values maybe should or should never be part of an ACL, depending on the nature of the ACL, right? 0000/0, depending on the nature of the ACL, should be there or shouldn't be there. And if you have multiple ACLs or multiple rules in an ACL, sometimes you might want to check those rules that they exist, and the value of the rule needs to be consistent across all of that. And so that's what this is trying to show you is in an example, these features exist in the platform to give you a lot of flexibility in how you want to build your golden configuration templates from JSON output from an API call, because they can get really complex. And so that's what this was about. So saving that, and hopefully that gives you some ground rules and some starters to kind of put the pieces together now as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to create a new child off of this base node. I'm going to rename it to something that makes sense. And we're going to call this AWS Network ACL. Now we'll get to where we started. Thank you for going with me down that side route. So I'm going to delete this one because we don't We don't need it anymore. And we'll just work with this node and this golden configuration. So I've created a new child node. Now we start off with an empty configuration here. Remember when we ran that task a moment ago? Whoops, was right here. And we got this output. Let me copy that output back again. So this was from a live call to describe the current network ACLs for this specific ACL ID that came from AWS. We use that now. Oops, sorry, we're in config manager. We can use that now here as our JSON object, as a starting object. When I say starting, because remember, we're building a template. We're building a template here. So if I paste that in here, it gives me now a starting point of what true output from that API call will look like, and we can start building rules instead of building it by hand like I did in the example. You really don't build a lot of things by hand, especially as they're complex. You want to start off with some real live data. So that's what this is, real live output. So if I save this, it's obviously a valid JSON because it just came from the output of something else. And let me explain what's going on here as well. You'll notice we have 4, remember this is an array. It's describing a network ACL set. So this is the set of network ACLs that are defined in AWS. And this is how AWS has chosen to define its network ACLs. And we have 4 of them in the array. So this would be element 0, 1, 2, 3. You have rule numbers, protocols. So these are the keys and the values that have been set: egress, true, CIDR block, and so on and so forth. So let's take a look just really quickly at the console so that we can kind of decipher where this is coming from. In this ACL, we have inbound rules and outbound rules. Inbound rules, the first one is 100. It's got this set right here to traffic type all, protocol all, port range all, source 0000, and an allow, and of course an implicit deny at the end. And then we have another set of outbound rules, starting with number 200, similar, an allow 0000 and a deny, implicit deny at the end. That's what this configuration is that we've been given through that API call that we made to AWS. Rule number 200, AWS chooses to say egress true, so that means exit. So this would be the outbound rule. Egress true is an outbound rule. Egress false is an inbound rule. So that would be ingress. Egress false is an inbound rule. This is just how they've chosen to define it. You'll see the rule numbers that we have created have numbers here, but the implicit ones have a rule number that's 32767. But everything else should be identical. Protocol any is identified as -1 according to AWS. So you kind of have to do a little deciphering. All of that, again, is in their documentation, but it's good for you to understand that's where this is coming from. Okay, so we've got that. We've created that. I've saved it. Now, how do we make an API call to AWS to describe the network ACL and compare it to this? So we'll use this as our starting block and then iterate. Remember, this is an iterative process as you're building these things. You're not gonna hit everything you want right from the very beginning. So now if I go to the manage section here, this is where we can allocate. If we're doing CLIs, it would be easier to understand. This is where I can assign a specific device to pull a configuration from to compare it to the golden config template. This is still a golden config template, but instead of a network device, we're doing an API call. So this should look a little familiar. If I click the plus, it's going to say, hey, add an adapter task. Which one of these adapter tasks would you like to use? Well, obviously, it's going to come from our AWS instance. Here, I'm just going to give it the name, describe network ACLs as a bit of a shortcut. Narrow it down to that, and it's going to give us a description of the ACL. This is the same call that I ran in the workflow earlier. So if I click add here, whoops, click add. Now I've got to give it a couple of bits of information. I need to give it an instance name and the very minimum network ACL ID. And again, we know the network ACL ID comes from here, from AWS dashboard. So now if I go back to here, I'm going to give it this same instance name and this same ACL ID. Click submit. And now it's created an instance here of this ACL. So now when I run a compliance check on this, it's going to make that API call into AWS, pull that JSON configuration down, just like we ran earlier, and it's going to compare it to this golden configuration here. So let's do that and see what happens. I run compliance check, you'll notice, we got some problems, we got some warnings, and I can tell you exactly what's going on. And this is part of the iteration process of building a golden configuration template. So there are some aspects of this JSON that shouldn't be here because they're going to change every single time you run it. So here's a couple of them. These metrics will change. That was the metrics that were from the original API call that we made from an automation. We don't really need that, nor do we want that. Same with the headers and all that. We don't need any of that. So we really should trim all of this out. That's kind of super unique to that particular API call at that moment. The other thing here is a request ID, and you'll start to learn to identify these things as you iterate through. But the compliance will give you some hints, and we'll take a look closer at that in a minute. So if I've removed those, I'm looking through here. These things should still be the same, but those things that I removed were unique and they change every single call. And again, if this is going to be a template that's applicable to many things, probably shouldn't be in there because it's always going to identify as, hey, this has changed, and those things we expect to change. Now we could have done an ignore rule on that, but it would have been a lot of ignore rules. It's easier just to delete it, but we want to make sure we delete it and maintain the integrity of the JSON object. So if I save it, it saves it because I kind of surgically remove those pieces without ruining the JSON object the way it's formatted, because it's always got to be formatted correctly. And again, the editor will give you some tips if things get askew. So I'm going to go back to here, and now let's run this again, and let's see what's going on. Okay, now there's less errors. We got passes and warnings. If I view the compliance, it's going to say, hey, there's some issues with the modify item here. If we look at the last one, it had issues with all that stuff that I removed. Told you we take a look at that. So now there's something going on with the modify item. Well, sometimes I'm not sure exactly what it is. It's talking about this section right here, but this is a great opportunity to use and ignore as we continue to iterate through all of this. So now if I save and go back to manage and run compliance report again, now you can see we came back all green. Fantastic. At least now we have a baseline that matches, right? So now I have a configuration, a golden configuration based off of JSON that matches what's being generated live from AWS for that particular ACL. So now we can start to make some changes here and see how this all works together. So one of the first things we could do, well, we've already done an ignore, but one of the other things we can do is we can maybe look at this default, right? So this is a pretty simple case. Default is equal true. Now this true is actually a string because it's in double quotes. It's not a Boolean, could be a Boolean, but again, AWS chose to represent it this way. So that's the way we're going to represent it. But if I click on this and right click on it, then it gives us the ability to now define what we want to, a rule that we want to define here. So let's see. We can now take a look at this and say, that default should be required. Again, look at the path. That default should be required. And then I can look at the object key and even check the value, and it's going to put true into here. So if I update that, now I've created a rule that says this should be required, but also this value should be true. So if I save this, so we created a rule here, and run compliance, it should come back as compliant, right? Because it is true. But that also gives us an opportunity to now start to play around with some of these features and see how they work. So if I change this to false, for instance, and I save it, go back and run our compliance, you'll notice, okay, now we've got some issues going on with that. So this is how you can start to build and iterate your rule set. So obviously we want to keep this at true. No, that will be in compliance. And ultimately, that's probably a good thing. We want the default set to true for this particular entry. But that allows us to now start to build more complex rules, right? So we can take one rule at a time and go through all of this. So remember earlier in our example where I talked about being able to iterate through a lot of like an array of values and and check for keys or keys and values. That's what I was trying to set the foundation for, is that here's an ACL. Egress and ingress. And again, this is just as an example because it fits that category pretty nicely, but this is not necessarily something you would do in production, but at least it gives us some categories to start playing around as an introduction to building these complex rules. And again, this you start to see this is a little more complex, right? So this is an array. So we're in an object. Response is another object within the object. Network ACL is part of this object. And one of the cool things is you can minimize and maximize, kind of get your mind around what's part of an object or not. So response has described network ACL response, which has some standalone objects, but then another object called network ACL set that has item, and so on and so forth until you get here. So you can see how it's important to have the ability to iterate through a bunch of different rules. Okay, so now let's take a look at this. We want to take a look at this. This is an array. So entry set. So these are all the entries for the network ACL for this particular ACL and AWS. And we have 4 rules. We figured out where those rules came from, to ingress, to egress, but we're going to use them as an example here. This is an array, so element 0, 1, 2, 3. We talked about that. Now I can click on here, and remember we have the ability to say this is required and this is required. Let's do this. Let's check every key. So this should now allow us in a single rule to iterate across all 4 of these entries under item, because remember, it's identifying this path as item 0. We're using that as an example, but cider block. But with this rule, we're now saying iterate through all of these and make sure that every element of this array has a key, just the key. That's all we're checking for, just the key called CIDR block, which they all have. So if I go to manage and run compliance, this should come back as compliant because they all have that. And I fixed the last rule that we did about the default equals true. So they all come back as compliant, which is good. So now we can also do something like check the value, because we're only checking for the key, that the key exists. And that's a key concept here, no pun intended, that you can check for a key, or you can that a key exists, or you can check for that a key exists and that an appropriate value is assigned with that key. So to do that, we just click this slider here and 0000. So if I update that, now it should still be compliant because they all have 0000. So if I click on go back to our compliance report here under manage. So yep, it's still compliant, but now it allows us to make some changes. So what if I change this now and I change our golden configuration to something completely different? So what is the expectation? Now the golden configuration template says cider block should exist for every element in under item, but it really needs to have 10, 10, 10, 10/32. And again, these are just you can think of these values as example values. That's not actually what's being checked. What's being checked is based off of the rule. And what's really being checked is, does the key exist? And in some cases, does the key exist with a certain value? So now that I've changed that, so now the expectation is that as it iterates through this, they should all have that 10, 10, 10, 10/32, which is not the case. We know from AWS that they're all 0000/0. So if I go back and I run a compliance report, there we go. We're seeing all kinds of, and I can view the compliance report. We can see that our cider block iterations not happy. So in order to correct it, obviously, we could either remove the check value, or we could go 0000/0, update, save, go back, manage, and then validate that everything's back in compliance again. Okay, that's great. So where did this all lead us to? This led us to at least building some basic baseline configuration rules for our JSON object that was returned from an API call. We can also now at this point, and the whole point of this is so that we can catch something that changes outside of the golden configuration. It's good to test your golden configuration rules so that you know that what's actually set up in the live environment and being able to iterate and play around and get your rules right. But what really this is all about is getting to a point where it's like, okay, this is a logical and valid golden configuration so that we can catch when somebody makes a change externally to that thing so that when the report gets run, we catch those changes because that means things are out of compliance, and that's the whole key to this. So if I go into my inbound rules, if I'm in the AWS dashboard now, if I edit this and I actually change this to 10.10.10.10/32, this should put it out of compliance for rule 100. So now I go back to configuration manager. Let's go back to the manage tab. Let's run our compliance. And indeed, that is the case. So if we look at the compliance report, it sees, yes, something, this should have been 0, but it was something else. But here's the thing, like this is a little item 2. What is that actually pointing to? Remember, it was an array, and it's saying this is really item 3 because the array starts at 0, 0, 1, 2 is the third element in the array, the item array. This is what this is pointing to, but you're going to see this a lot. That's not very descriptive, identifying something by the array element, even though that's the way it's done. So we've built a nice little feature here that helps to identify what that actually is. So for instance, I can, if instead of identifying something by array, I can reference another key within that element, and that should be unique enough for me to identify it. So this rule number is another key that I can reference. So if I click on this rule again, and up here I got keys, so then I can specify a different key, rule number, for this particular rule. So instead of the element number, it's going to give me the rule number value. So it's gonna reference the rule number key that's defined for this element and give me the value as the descriptor, which then allows me to go back to AWS's console and go, oh, I know exactly what that is. Oops, got to save it. Now we'll go to manage, run compliance. Okay, it's still out of compliance, which is what we expected, but we really want to be able to see, aha, this is the rule number. Rule 100 is what it's saying. Um, Oops. And so if I go to the AWS VPC console, you'll see rule number 100. So instead of element 2, which doesn't make sense within the application, now I can reference the rule number that was part of that element. And that tells me immediately, aha, this is the problem. And I can go in and fix it. Or yeah, you could run this in an automation and automatically remediate it using that information. Okay, so we've built out all of this. We've made a change in AWS. We've caught it in our golden configuration. We're using an API call, right, into AWS to describe a VPC, comparing it to this, which is our standard. We've built rules on it. This process is the same for regardless of whatever network service, whether it's a tradition, maybe you're making a call to a Meraki controller, right? Or to Cloud Vision, or maybe you're doing something in Azure. That process will hold true for all of it. Find your API call, pull down the output from it, take a look at it. Maybe you reference some API documentation from the vendor, you determine the fields and how they work, and then you start building your rule set. So if you're going to do something in Azure, it's going to look very much the same. It's going to have a different set of API calls. It's going to have a different look to the configuration in JSON because every cloud platform, every service is different. But the idea is the same. We can start creating rules. Here's a rule for certain prefixes, and we should disallow 0000/0, which makes perfect sense, right? You can start to do this. For AWS, I used, for our example, I used network ACLs. But for AWS, you could use an API call to a security group, and you can pull in security groups and build rules upon those. In this case, to, again, probably good idea to deny certain values. In this case, it's a variable called CIDRIP, and then you can replace variables in our automation as well, but this variable points to 0000/0. So again, these are different API calls using golden configuration to build JSON-based golden config templates for all of this. So let's wrap this up with a couple of last things. So we started here in Automation Studio with a single step automation. Everything that I showed you in Configuration Manager around running, creating, and running, all of this, especially running this, can be automated in a single task. You can run this in a single task. So let me show you that now. So I'm in Automation Studio. This is where we build automations. I can create a new workflow. I can call this webinar run AWS API compliant report AWS. So we'll create a new workflow and make it super simple. For this, we need, so I can search, so the built-in tasks into the platform. We need run compliance or tree. So this is an API call that's part of our platform. So it's an API call within our platform that basically runs the compliance check the way I was running it manually in Configuration Manager. This is part of the Configuration Manager set of features. And so if I double click this gives me the variables that need to run for this API task. It needs a tree ID, it needs a version. So it's always good to figure out where those things come from. They come from Configuration Manager, similar to how you have to reference certain things from like AWS to get the identifier. If I go back to our compliance example, we need a tree ID and a version. So if I go here and view metadata, here's our tree ID that I can use, and here's our version. It's called initial. So now I'll go back to our workflow, and our tree ID, I just paste into here, and our version is initial. Now, if I save this, one thing we can note real quick, if I manage and we view compliance, the last time is 3:52 p.m. So now if I go back to our automation and run this from here, I'm running it in more of a test as I'm building this. It's finished. I can double click it, and I want to look at the outgoing. So this is the data that came from the task being run. And okay, so you'll notice it ran successfully here, and it batched it up in the background. So if I go back to Configuration Manager here and I view our compliance again, we just ran 3:57, which is the time now. So it just ran that. So instead of me clicking here, running compliance, now I can run it from an automation. Pretty much everything in our platform, every feature that you click on can be done in some way, in some automated task. And so why is that? So now we can take this. This is saved. Now I can go into another area of our platform called, well, we've been at Operations Manager, but we've looked at it for jobs. Now let's look at it for automation. So we were under jobs before, watching jobs run. But now under Operations Manager, we can actually publish an automation that we've created. So what we've done is we've created an automation that runs a compliance tree, right? We've built the compliance tree, the golden configuration template, and the compliance tree inside the Configuration Manager, which is another side of our application. And so now I can create a new automation, run API compliance. I got to give it a name for AWS. Create. So now it's asking me, okay, what's the workflow we want to run? Well, we just created that workflow here. It's called webinar run API compliance report for AWS. So let's filter that. Webinar run. There we go. And so now we have to tell it how to run this. And that's what a trigger is. How should this be run? So if I click plus, it's going to ask me for a new trigger. And this is going to be a schedule, maybe daily. Maybe we run this daily. And I can choose an API, an event, a manual, or schedule. API allows us to put an API endpoint available. And if you have if you have a secure way if you have the authentication to access that API endpoint, token, username, password, things like that, then you can call the REST API endpoint, and it would run this automation. An event would be in response to a particular system event. This could be run. Manual allows somebody to manually run this, literally, like it could be self-serve, like any of these things here. We could have a form attached to it, but really we want to schedule this. There really should be no form. We just want to repeat this thing, right? So we can start perhaps tomorrow. maybe 2 a.m. We definitely want to repeat it every day. If a run gets missed for some reason, it's fine. We'll skip it and save changes. And now that's it. So now this particular automation will run that workflow which runs this particular report, and it will generate these compliance reports. So if you were to check these compliance reports every day at 2 a.m., you'll see these gathering. And you could even have another automated task to go through. We could create another automation to go through and generate alerts and alarms based off of those compliance reports, right? We could have a daily automated task to go, or it could be part of the automation we created here as well. I wanted to keep it simple, but you have a lot of options here. So you could generate a report. You could have the report get generated, and if it hits a certain amount of a certain score based off of the severity errors that it might error warnings and infos that it gets, you could have a severity score, or that we could identify, and maybe if it's above a certain threshold or below a certain threshold, it could integrate with your email system, send an email out. It could integrate with your ServiceNow, open tickets up, or it could integrate with, um, your Slack or your MS Teams to notify, the team. Hey, this thing just did a compliance report and something terribly wrong. The score is, at a certain threshold, and so somebody needs to take a look at it. Or depending on the nature of the changes, because all of the report details, and especially what compliance issues were recovered or found, all of that's actually available programmatically in the automation in our automation studio as well. So you can even pull that information and even and build remediation for certain amounts of certain types of changes, so that you can automatically be remediated. And your integration could then just update the team. Hey, we saw this compliance issue. It was a security group. We went ahead and fixed it based off of maybe a source of truth, and we know it should look like this. Maybe we pulled this from a database or from a source of truth for GitLab or something like that. We went ahead and applied it to the network ACL, and here are the changes. Here's what it looked like before. Here's what it looked like after that. That all can be done within the automation platform actually quite easily, and we do it quite a bit for our customers as well to help them out so they can see how powerful this is. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for the time. Hopefully, this gave you the ability to kind of see the process, to get you an introduction to the process for API compliance, because it is a new type of world for network engineers, who instinctively know CLI and can generate configurations for CLI and golden config templates for CLI. They instinctively know these things. But now, as we start to see more and more modern networking elements that have more programmability and APIs, it's critically important to understand not only how to use REST APIs, but the output of the data that comes from that. And that's exactly what we do in our platform. So thank you very much for the time. Hopefully this was beneficial to you, and we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you soon. Bye-bye.